Hello, everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by IRI Consultants. IRI empowers leaders to prevent and solve mission-critical workforce issues through holistic and sustainable strategies. For more information, you can visit IRI at iriconsultants.com. I am Jennifer Orquah, Director of Business Development for IRI, and your host for this episode of Project HR. In a time when we've all been focused on our own personal well-being, it is perhaps only natural that companies focus on the same thing, workforce well-being. After the last few years, the importance of employee well-being, along with a deeper understanding of the need for resilience and empathy in our workplaces, are factors that are appreciated and valued more today than they have been ever before. As a result, some larger companies are now proving their commitment to wellness by establishing a new role within their organizations, the role of Chief Wellness Officer. To talk with us about this new trend, we are once again joined by Kathryn Mayer. Up until recently, Kathryn was the Senior Benefits Editor and Health and Benefits Conference Chair at Human Resource Executive. She just joined SHRM as Benefits and Compensation Editor. We last spoke with Kathryn in early 2021 about mental health and human resources. Kathryn, congratulations on the move to SHRM. It is great to have you back here on Project HR.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. So excited to talk with you again.
Yeah, so you wrote about this new role back in August of this year in an article for Human Resource Executive that was titled "The Rise of the Chief Wellness Officer. Is This Trend Growing?" So, where did you first hear about this role?
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I did hear a little bit about it, I would say over the last maybe 2 years, particularly among healthcare organizations who have had employees dealing with burnout at an extraordinary rate for obvious
Mm.
reasons. And I think I heard a little bit from a few different universities who created a role as well. Higher ed is notoriously very forward thinking when it comes to positions and employee benefits as well. But this year it came up in a few different conversations I had with industry insiders and some companies I spoke to. And I talked to Aon, to EY, both whom developed this role this year, which are both mentioned in the article. And
Mhm.
I was like, this is really starting to pick up steam. And even since that article had come out, I had interviewed the chief people officer of Sweetwater, which is a music company. And he had mentioned that they not long ago created a chief wellness officer position as well. So
Mm.
certainly over the last year or half a year, I've really heard a lot more about it. So it's pretty exciting.
So, is it fair to say that the growth of this role for many organizations is tied to a return to office strategy to smooth the transition, at least initially?
Right, right. I think that's definitely an interesting observation and probably part of it. I do know, like I mentioned, there are a handful of organizations that had developed the role even prior to those conversations, even prior to the pandemic, believe it or not. But generally speaking, the pandemic certainly sped things up. And yes, I would say a return to office strategy has spurred this role for some. That is the case in part for EY. From what I was told in 2021, EY was thinking about its employee experience strategy, which included conversations about its return to office strategy. And they said they kept coming back to this theme of well being. So they said, wouldn't it be great to create a team that's just focused on well being? And return to office strategy, which you just mentioned, obviously is so interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's been
Hmm.
part of the conversation lately. And there's so many contrasting opinions on it, kind of a point of contention
Hmm.
among a lot of different people. And the last couple of years has been so difficult and uncertain, obviously, very scary in many ways. And so many employees had to adjust to working remotely, then obviously got used to that with kind of a lot of people, I think, feeling the benefits to doing that in regards to
Hmm.
their well-being. You could take your dog on a walk or maybe cook a healthy meal at home, or you're not worried about commuting, which if you're people like my husband, he rips his hair out every time he does it. So of course one of the best benefits is it's trying to stay healthy during the pandemic too. And then so after 2 years of doing this, of working remotely, then they're told, actually, you have to come back to the office. So that
Hmm.
adjustment alone, I think, is really jarring. And it's known to take a dive in people's well being, and it certainly raises stress. So I think it's definitely smart for companies to think, okay, so how can we ease this transition, and how do we focus on employee well-being right now? And having a role that really focuses on employees' well-being, that's huge.
And for most of us who really haven't sort of seen this role in
Yeah.
action, let's talk a little bit about that role. Does it preside over a wellness team? Are there other people underneath this person? How does that work?
Yeah. So I think it's yes and no. I think from my understanding, I mean, it certainly depends on the organization. And obviously it's fairly new for a lot of organizations. But I do believe some firms like EY, they did in fact create a wellness team, which is really neat. Others I do believe work primarily kind of island, so to speak, with their role.
Mm.
But they definitely work with the HR teams, and
Mhm.
the C suite as well.
So, what does a wellness officer and their team do? Like, what are their responsibilities?
Right. So, I mean, to dumb it down, I guess it's really what it sounds like. It's a role that's meant to really focus on employee well-being. So, how workers are doing, what they
Mm.
need, what tools and programs would help, and so on. A common thread that I'm seeing among people with this role is that first and foremost, they're trying to figure out how their employees are feeling, how
Mm.
they're faring, and they're trying to measure well-being components and trying to understand how workers cope with stress and change and other mental health challenges. So, that's certainly an important first step because obviously there's an argument for you're not really going to help employees with their well-being if you don't know what those issues are and what they're dealing with.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
from there, they're rolling out benefits, they're tweaking existing wellness programs, they're seeing what works for their organization and maybe also what doesn't work. I mean, that's a big important part I think that a lot of organizations sometimes
Mhm.
miss. And then of course creating the right culture of the
Mm.
organization. That's certainly a big part of that as well.
All right, so for sure we need to talk about the elephant in the room. I mean, these are typically HR responsibilities,
Yeah.
making sure that our employees are well taken care of. So, what's been the response from HR teams to the creation of this role?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in most cases, especially with these larger firms, the role of chief wellness officer works in tandem with HR. So, I mean,
Mm.
that's certainly the goal. I think it's a great thing. And it could be a great partnership because wellness is such a big HR responsibility. And, that's now the case more than ever. I think it goes to show how vital the employee wellness focus is right now.
Mm.
But, I think what's important to realize, and, I think a lot of us in this space do, is that largely speaking, HR teams are slammed right now. So,
Mhm.
sometimes for these large, or I'm sorry, for smaller firms in particular, you're talking about sometimes a one, two, three-person HR team dealing with
Mhm.
all these facets of HR. So from payroll and benefits to managing employee absences or
Mhm.
complaints or diversity, recruiting and retention, which is obviously huge right now.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
I mean, you add well being and wellness on top of that, which is again so much bigger than it's ever been and a lot bigger than physical health, but mental health and financial health and social health and so on. So, you're talking about a huge job. And,
Mm.
you're talking about keeping however many of your employees you have in your organization well during a really fragile time in our history when our well
Mm.
being is really not so great. So, you can see why it's a full time job. And, I think that people in HR are going to welcome this role because it's a part of HR and because I would think that they could use, honestly, all the help they can get.
Yeah, reinforcements for sure.
Yeah, right?
Yep, yep. All right, Catherine, I'm going to take a quick sponsorship break right now, but when we return, I want to get into the strategy behind one company's efforts to address employee wellness. Stay with us.
If you've ever been involved in a union organizing effort, you know that a campaign can swallow up internal resources with an appetite like no other issue. You need to be prepared to reach employees in a way that is not only cost effective, but accurate and timely. IRI Consultants Digital Solutions Group understands the challenges of reaching bargaining unit employees and is here to help. Delivery can include not just videos and websites, but social media, texting, podcasts, apps, and more. With IRI's digital solutions team by your side, you can keep up with campaign messaging while supporting your direct relationship with employees. Our consultants will help you craft a comprehensive strategy that promotes employee engagement and supports your positive employee relations philosophy. Contact us today at iriconsultants.com to get started with your digital communication strategy.
I'm back now with Kathryn Mayer, Benefits and Compensation Editor for SHRM. Now, Kathryn, in your article, you discussed two companies that have created a chief wellness officer within their C-suites, EY and Aon. Were these companies part of the first wave of this effort, or is there something about their approaches that made them stand out to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think yes and no to the first wave. I think what interests me most about these firms in particular is really the size and the scope of them. So, EY has, 350,000 employees globally. Aon has 50,000 workers. So, we're talking really well-known employers with a lot of employees. And I think anytime we're seeing a large organization that is participating in some kind of a movement, it catches attention and it often becomes a trend because other organizations are watching you. The other thing is that, these are big professional services and consulting firms that work with tons of employers. So maybe they're swaying some of those organizations to not only focus on wellness, but maybe add that role to their own organization. So I think it may have big implications, which makes those two in particular stand out to me.
I want to talk a little bit about metrics here. The concept of wellness can be, it seems like it's a little bit nebulous to measure. Certainly physical health statistics are easy enough to assess, but other aspects are infinitely harder to evaluate. How do companies measure success?
Oh my gosh, that's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? uh, Employers now than ever, I think it seems they're asking employees how they're doing. And, it's stress, depression, anxiety, burnout, how are you feeling? And what are your
Mhm.
concerns? What's going on? I think to measure the difference any programs or initiatives that you as an organization is making is you do have to keep asking employees. And that is a theme I think we keep seeing is the importance of really talking to workers all the time. We've all
Mhm.
heard of the annual employee survey, but
Mhm.
annual, like that's not gonna do
Mhm.
anything at this point. So,
Right,
you're
right.
looking at the last few years, how much changes in a month, a weekly basis, and even a daily basis. So, it's been absolutely insane. So you've really got to keep measuring. You've got to keep surveying employees all the time. And
Mhm.
places like EY and Aon, from my understanding, have a well-being index where they're constantly looking at and measuring employee wellness based on a number of different indicators, including the ones I just mentioned,
Mhm.
stress, depression levels, stuff like that. And also, as far as some of those mental health issues, I think there's other data points you can look at. Like you said, I mean, it is nebulous, it's really difficult, but
Mhm.
you can look at some stuff that maybe you already have in hand, like medical and health claims, or maybe you see upticks in employee absences, or maybe there's a dive in productivity. I think
Mhm.
there's other indicators that you can look at as well. And sometimes, especially if you're a manager, I think your workers, your team. So I think you can
Mhm.
sometimes spot sometimes the difference. And I think that's part of it is you kind of have to train your managers on
Mhm.
noticing some of these things as well.
And I'm fascinated by Aon's Human Sustainability Index. Like
Mhm.
it's way more than just a survey or a questionnaire. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And that goes along with, what we just talked about, which is, how organizations and chief wellness officers who are measuring how employees are doing and feeling. And the Human Sustainability Index is a performance tracker of corporate well-being that Aon's chief wellness officer Rachel Fellows had developed. She was a consultant, and this was even before she joined Aon. So when she joined, Aon actually had bought it when she came on board. And through that index, organizations can measure well being and resilience and human sustainability at an individual level, at a team level, and an organization level. So I think that's what makes that kind of really interesting. So basically, in short, it measures how resilient workers are and then how they cope with stress and change and other mental health challenges. So Aon uses that index for its own employees, but they also have it for their clients. And
Mm-hmm.
then based on the data that's collected, Aon will kind of come up with some ideas on how to improve sustainability and how to improve well-being, whether it be coaching or training or specific benefits. So yeah, it's really fascinating.
And it's really all about optimal performance, like making sure that people are well taken care of so that they can produce at their highest level.
Sure.
So I find that really, really interesting that they've kind of tied these wellness metrics to the bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, everything that organizations do with well being, obviously it's going to look good on paper, but there's kind of
Mm.
this selfish reason behind it, which is, you're going to have better workers, right? You're going to have more
Mhm.
productive workers if you're going to have healthier workers. And if they're engaged and feeling good and feeling good with the company, then that's really good for an employer's bottom line. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think even before COVID, our collective thoughts on the definition of wellness had expanded beyond just physical health into a more comprehensive view of what it means to be well, mental health, financial health, social wellness. Is this expansion another reason to spin off another role?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love talking about wellness because it's just so important and so fascinating. Obviously, I am biased, but but you're exactly right. I think when I first started covering employee benefits and health over a decade ago, most of the conversation was physical health. So it was about, I'd written about step challenges and fitness goals and gym memberships and weight loss competitions and things like that. They're all important. I mean, don't get me wrong, but
Mhm.
but health and well-being is so much more than that, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So, everything you mentioned, which is mental health, financial health, social, professional, a sense of purpose, that's so important. And with each passing year, I think we're realizing this more and more and realizing how connected all these components are. And
Mhm.
if you're feeling financially fragile, for instance, you're really stressed out, you're not going to be as mentally well. And
Mhm.
obviously, stress makes people sick. It can result in physical health issues. And if we're not dealing with all these health issues collectively, we're not going to be the best employees. So
Mhm.
there's such that connection between all the components. And again, we've discovered this more than ever with the pandemic. Absolutely. Things have been more fragile than they've ever been and more important than they've ever been. And I think that the chief wellness officer role is really a testament to all of this and really to the fragile state of well-being we're experiencing. And really just how important it is to have healthy workers in every sense of the word because, like we just said, it makes them good, productive workers. And it's also the right thing to do.
Mhm. Well, and talking about the role itself, any
Mhm.
C-suite position really has to look at the entire organization in a holistic sense, not just the thing that I'm doing, but all the things that everybody's doing that contribute to the success of the organization. So, a chief wellness officer has to manage current stresses that employees are experiencing. They've got to look ahead to see what stresses might be coming. What are the primary qualifications for this role?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I would like to think that people in these positions, they have a real calling to helping employees and that they're empathetic people. They have a real keen understanding of the very real stresses, the very real challenges that employees are facing. And
Mm.
I also think they have to have a good understanding of how varied workers are, how varied people's responses and reactions and, kind of what sets them off because they have to relate to a lot of different people. So, because wellness is absolutely not one size fits all. And there really has to be a response to helping a lot of different people. I
Mm.
think in my mind, that's first and foremost. I think that they obviously have to have a good grasp of employee benefits, of course, and about the
Mm.
many wellness components that make up the entire scope of employee well being. And they're aware of some of the latest, most important trends, again, in physical health, mental health, financial, health, which is very big right now, especially given the very, high inflation that we've seen and a result of that very high financial stress.
Hmm.
And yeah, I love what you just had brought up about bringing, not just managing those current stresses, but also looking ahead to see what
Hmm.
stresses, may be coming down the pike. That's so important because if you're focused on only what's right now, you might miss what's next. You have to do everything you can to prepare and kind of look at those trends and kind of think, what's going to happen and how is this going to affect my workers?
This almost sounds like a really good role for an HR person to step into. That obviously they get into
Yeah.
it because they enjoy helping people. I mean, this sounds like a perfect fit for a next step for somebody who's in an HR kind of role.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think it's the people, if you're so excited about wellness, which I think a lot of HR people are, I mean, this is
Hmm.
absolutely perfect. And I think that is kind of what happens sometimes is some of those people in the organization already then kind of
Hmm.
step into this role. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Catherine, it's time for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Orqua, and my guest today is Kathryn Mayer, Benefits and Compensation Editor for SHRM. We're back, and Catherine, some might want to dismiss this role as an offshoot of the pandemic, something that'll disappear once everything gets back to normal. Would you agree with that assessment, or do you see this role as having a greater shelf life than that?
That's a great question. There's so many things that have happened as a result of the pandemic that maybe eventually was going to happen, but
Mm,
innovation was certainly sped up because of some of these circumstances. Remote work is certainly one of these that pops up, I think, in everyone's mind. But but even if and when the pandemic changes, if things get more or less back to normal, I mean, we're not gonna get back to where we were. Our normal is really different now. We're different
mm,
people and the world of work is certainly different as well. The I do think the pandemic has absolutely proven that wellness is so business imperative. But
mm,
at the same time, I do think that there is a consensus that was the case and is the case even putting aside the pandemic because wellness has
mhm,
become so important, so tied into every facet of our lives. And specifically when it comes to chief wellness officers, I would think it's more of an indication of how vital wellness has become and not simply a reaction of the pandemic. That's what I
mhm.
would argue. We'll see what happens, but I'm optimistic that this will be a trend that not only stays but probably grows with time because we're kind of in the early part of this.
And we talked about it being a basically like a retention and a recruitment
Right.
strategy. So what are the benefits that this new role brings to a company in that respect?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up. I mean, especially again in this like hot job market, it's so important. I think it could have a tremendous impact on
Mm,
recruitment and retention. It's very attractive to employees and potential hires in a hot job market where employees, have more opportunities to leave for other opportunities. I think forward thinking employers are going above and beyond, and employees consistently rank well-being efforts as important to them. Benefits, including wellness benefits, whether it's financial wellness programs or gym stipends or mental health days and EAPs, huge
mhm,
list, of course. They're
mhm,
absolutely increasingly important to workers, but even beyond this, and you brought this up at the very beginning, is I think that there's this bigger picture, a bigger value on who my employer is, what they do, what
mm,
kind of good they do. Do they
mhm,
truly care about employees? Do they go above and beyond to help them and treat them like people and not just workers? And I think a focus on well-being does that, and to have an executive in your organization dedicated to that says
mhm.
a lot.
Yeah, it definitely sends a message. So
Yeah,
what sort of benefits do workers themselves reap from this? Beyond obviously retention recruitment, we talk about that, but what about to
sure.
the individual employee?
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal obviously is, you're making a difference in people's lives so people can be healthier, they're more mentally well, they're budgeting better, they have more money in their pocketbook, they have
Mm,
a better handle on coping with stress, and I think again that is so important right now. Yeah, I mean, it just makes a difference for the employee, and I think it does make them feel more engaged and just kind of have a better understanding of, how can I cope with some of these challenges, and
Hmm.
also feel like I'm kind of doing this with my employer instead of I'm kind of doing this alone without them.
Mm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And
Yeah.
going back to the article, you mentioned that chief wellness officers are typically right now only found in larger companies. Do you see that changing over time?
I I certainly think it's possible, and obviously the thing with larger companies is they have the resources, they have more money, they have more funds to fund a position like this, and I think that's
Hmm.
obviously why it's more prominent with larger organizations.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, smaller firms don't always have that luxury. Like I said, a lot of times those HR teams could be one person to, two or three
Hmm.
people. However, I do see it potentially being a natural shift and a natural progression in HR, kind of like you had said, maybe someone in that HR team, it makes sense for them to
Hmm.
move into this role. And we've seen that a little bit too with chief diversity officers, right? They've grown in
Hmm.
popularity, for instance, over the last couple of years as well. So I could see this kind of happening as well. So, I'm really excited to see what does happen and how this grows among
Hmm.
employers of all sizes. I think that'll be really, really interesting to watch.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch. So, if our listeners want to find out more about you or about your work with SHRM, where can we go?
Yeah, so you could certainly go to shrm.org and find a bunch of my articles. Also, the Chief Wellness Officer article is on hrexecutive.com. Still, obviously, a big fan of them. So you can see all my
Hmm.
articles there as well. And for me personally, find me on LinkedIn, or you can follow me on Twitter at Mayor Editor. I usually tweet out a bunch of articles and probably a little bit too much about Jeopardy as well. So,
All right,
so yeah.
that's a whole separate conversation we're going to have. All right, I want to let everybody know that links to Kathryn's article as well as to Human Resource Executive and SHRM will be noted in this week's episode companion guide, which you can grab for free at iriconsultants.com/podcast. All right, right now though, Kathryn, it is time for our lightning round questions, and these are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
All right, let's do it.
I wish I had a Jeopardy question ready for you. But the first question is always a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about the rise in chief wellness officers. In your opinion, Kathryn, which of these health and wellness idioms is preferred? Would you rather be considered the picture of health or be declared fit as a fiddle?
So, I mean, I'm definitely a fan of alliteration, but I've got to go with picture of health because, like we've talked about, health and wellness is about so much more than being fit.
Yes. And I'm not even sure what that means, fit as a fiddle. So,
Yeah.
all right, Kathryn, what is the best book you've read recently?
I tend to say nonfiction, and I read a lot of serious books, but I do love fiction a lot, and for the escape. And so, in keeping with prioritizing well-being, I'm
Mhm.
going to say a more fun read, which is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Love that book.
Very good. All right, what's your favorite thing about the work that you do?
Getting to tell these amazing stories and trends like the chief wellness officers and hopefully making a difference for the employers and HR leaders who might read my articles and with that, really make a difference for the thousands and thousands of employees who these leaders have.
Very nice. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
So I've been in the middle of kind of a big personal creative project, and both my husband and my grandmother had kept telling me that you kind of have to put your worries aside about perfecting it. It's kind of better to get it done because that is the biggest part of the battle. Yeah, so get it done rather than get it perfect because, you're never going to get it perfect.
Right, for sure. All right, last question. Who or what inspires you?
Yeah, I just think that people who are driven by kindness and character and maybe a little bit of fun and sarcasm thrown in. And that includes, I would say, my parents and my late grandmother.
Very nice. Kathryn, thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of Project HR.
Oh, I was so happy to be here. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
I also want to thank our listeners. Here's a final reminder to unlock your access to this episode's companion guide at iriconsultants.com/podcast. If you're ready for your Project HR debut, our team is always looking for outstanding guests. Let us know about your expertise at projecthr@iriconsultants.com. Don't forget to subscribe to Project HR. A new episode posts every Thursday. Finally, drop me a line, leave us a review, or give the show a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's all for this week's episode of Project HR. Let's make it a great day at work.